Hi, I will be talking about the neurocomputational mechanisms of social influence in goal-directed learning, focusing on the interplay between direct learning and social learning. Let me start with the three levels of understanding into cognition proposed by David Marr. So here, the first level is computation, which refers to the goal or problem to be solved. And then the second level is algorithm, which indicates the underlying mapping between input and outputs. And lastly, implementation corresponds to the neural or physical basis. I'm giving you one concrete example here. This is myself climbing in French Alps. If I want to figure out how to climb faster or much easier, I cannot study the views alone. Instead, I have to understand the views in the context of the climbing behavior, which is my goal, and then to see how features of views could help me achieve this goal. These three levels of distinction are helpful to understand behavior, cognition, and the brain. Why am I telling you this? Because not surprisingly, Marr's three levels could also be applied to the field of social neuroscience, particularly at the computational level. You might be cooperating with others to achieve the same goal, or you might be competing against others because there is only a limited amount of resources. And this, of course, also applies to social learning, which is the topic of my talk. But why studying social learning or studying the social brain in the first place? Perhaps it is because the human brain is inherently social. There is evidence from evolutionary biology that when solving physical problems, there is no difference in terms of performance between human and their closest cousins. However, when solving social problems, we as humans are performing incredibly better than the other animals. And then this is likely because humans have the largest group size as opposed to the other animals, and then this group size is associated with the largest neocortex volume. So all these pieces of evidence suggest that the social learning capacity is arguably unique to human intelligence. Now that the social learning is so special, the standard reinforcement learning framework is rather limited. Instead, we need to examine how learning emerges under a social context. This is relevant to our everyday life. For example, if you go to a Chinese restaurant for the first time, you might need to observe the others to better improve your own muscle skills to use the chopsticks. And even in this current COVID time, we are still learning from others every single day. So in particular, under the three levels of analysis, we aim to provide answers to three research questions to study social learning. So namely, how does knowing about others' decision influence my own choice? What is the underlying algorithm by which social learning is integrated into my own learning, and how is such computation implemented in the brain? So one particularly important question here is the so-called social specificity, namely, is there a socially specific computation and neural implementation as opposed to the non-social components? And more specifically to our study, here we aim to investigate whether there is a parallel or even distinct direct learning versus social learning, and whether they're implemented differently in the brain. So to study these research questions experimentally, we use the probabilistic reversal learning task with abstract symbols. And here is the reversal learning task. One stimulus is more rewarding than the other, and the reward contingency reverses multiple times. In this case, the reward probability of the blue option is 0.7 in the beginning and becomes 0.3 and then back to 0.7 for multiple times. Such a task design then motivates the participant to learn and then to relearn to maximize their outcome. The social component on top of that is introduced by recruiting 5 participants at the same time, and then they perform the task truly simultaneously without deception. And we tested nearly 200 participants, and within each group, one person was always inside MRI scanner, and the remaining 4 were sitting outside. The task procedure looks like this. Now suppose you are a participant. On each trial, you will need to make your first choice between the blue and the yellow options, and then you need to place your bets between 1, 2, and 3, which depicts the post-decision wagering. And I will explain how the bet works in a second. And after you have seen all of the choices from the others, you could adjust your choice as well as your bet. And finally, your second choice and the second bet will determine your outcome on this trial. And you will also observe the outcome from the others. And in this case, to explain the bet a little bit more, a bet of 3 is multiplied with the reward unit 20 cents, and you will get a 60 cents for this trial. So what behavior do we see here? As you could imagine, we looked at how choices from the other people could affect the second choice and then the second bet of the participants. And at this stage, the 4 choices from the others could formulate 3 levels of group coherence, like 2 yellow, 2 blue, 3 yellow, 1 blue, and 4 yellow, no blue. And also depends on which one you chose in the first place. So if you choose yellow, you will be with the majority of the group. And if you choose blue, you will be against the majority of the group. So here I first plot the choice switch probability, namely how likely you switch to the alternative choice option as a function of the group coherence in both the with and against conditions. Not surprisingly, the more agreeing social information you see, the less likely you switch your choice. And conversely, the more opposing social information you see from the others, the more likely you switch your choice to the alternative. As for the bets, I plot the bet difference here using the second bet minus the first bet. We show that the previous effect flipped. So the more agreeing information you see from the others, the more you increase your bets. And then there is no statistical difference in the against condition. So moving next, what are the cognitive processes that underlying here the previous behavior? We ask ourselves, how can we model that, or what to be modeled? This brought us back to our experimental design. We have, of course, the first choice and the first bet, the second choice and the second bet. And beyond that, we have the choices from the other people before participants make their adjustments. And we call that the instantaneous social information. And then at the outcome stage, besides obtaining the self-outcome, which represents direct learning, participants could also track the performance of the others, which indicates social learning. So all these elements are then therefore the building blocks of our computational model. And this is perhaps too much detail, and I will briefly walk you through the conceptual idea using a much nicer illustration. So in essence here, the first choice and the first bets are predicted by parallel but integrated value signals from both direct learning and social learning, and such initial valuation information together with the observed instantaneous social information predict the second choice and then the second bet. Importantly, the value from the direct learning is updated from a double updating risk-Wagner model, updating both the chosen and unchosen options, and then the value from the social learning is updated by tracking the others' cumulative reward history, like how well the others performed over the last 3 trials. So to summarize, we show that social influence affects both choice and the bets. Using a computational model, we found that the behavior adjustment is predicted by the instantaneous social information, and learning is a weighted combination of direct learning and social learning. So, okay, now remember that we are interested in the social specificity. So to answer this question, we used the winning model at hand, and we derived the value signals from direct learning and from social learning, and we regressed them against the fMRI signals in the design matrix to examine the neural implementation. So we observed that the VMPFC, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is computing value from direct learning V self, and then the ACC anterior cingulate cortex is computing value from social learning, the V other. More interestingly, using a double dissociation approach, we demonstrate that the VMPFC is only associated with V self, but not V other, and conversely, the ACC is only associated with V other, but not V self. For the reward prediction error, namely the difference between the reward and the value, it is not so surprising that we observe the ventral striatum, but we further justify this signal by inspecting the 2 theoretical subcomponents of the reward prediction error, which is the reward and the value. We extract the time series in the ventral striatum and then plot the correlation coefficients with the reward and the value at onset of the outcome, respectively. And the striatal activity is not only positively correlated with the reward, but also negatively correlated with the value, which then justifies the prediction error signal. For the neuron substrates of the instantaneous social information, we observe the activity in the right temporal parietal junction, the RTPJ, together with other areas like the insula and frontal cortex. And for the subsequent behavior adjustment, the switch was a steady contrast leads to the activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. And the next question we seek to answer is, how do these regions interact? To this aim, we conducted a PPI analysis to examine how the behavior adjustment modulates the functional coupling when seated at the brain's social hub, the TPJ. So the results show that the coupling between the RTPJ and the left putamen is modulated by the behavioral adjustment, which was a stay. So since the TPJ activity and the behavioral change are related to the instantaneous social information, we wondered, could it be that the putamen is computing a social prediction error? So to test this hypothesis, we constructed a social prediction error that is the difference between the actual agreements of the group and the expected agreements of the group. We then did the similar analysis at the reward prediction error, and we found that the activity in the left putamen is indeed positively correlated with the actual agreement and negatively correlated with the expected agreement. Thus, we are able to interpret this signal as a social prediction error signal. So together, our neuroimaging findings may establish a network of social influence in decision-making. Particularly, the two frontal areas, the VMPFC and the ACC, are computing values from direct learning and social learning, and then this translates from the connectivity via the switch was a state behavior together with the regions that are related to social signals. So to summarize, we show that using model-based fMRI, these two dissociable value signals from direct learning and social learning are respectively represented in the VMPFC and the ACC. And importantly, our connectivity analysis revealed a network of social influence in decision-making. And I hope I have convinced you that, at least in our study, we have shown the social specificity from all the levels of the Mars understanding of cognition. Thank you all for your attention.